Welcome, everyone. We're just sort of letting folks in as they sign on, and we'll get going in just a second. Okay. So some folks are still signing on, but just to be starting on time, we'll just get going and I can let folks in. This is being recorded, so if you missed the beginning, you can catch it later. But welcome, everyone. This is the third webinar in our knowledge learning series. So today we're going to be discussing assessing your E&T funding and talking about how to stretch those non-federal dollars and a great review of the reimbursement structure. So my name is Steph Smith. I'm the Senior Associate with the National Community Action Partnership. And today's webinar will be hosted by our friends at Seattle Jobs Initiatives, which Susan O'Callahan and Bob Thibodeau will be presenting. And we have a very special guest from Washington State Neighborhood House. Brianna is going to sort of take us through their experience as it relates to this webinar's topic. So that will be super exciting, and we're glad you all are here. We would encourage you guys to use the chat for questions or unmute and just sort of, ask your questions. Try to make this as engaging as possible. And again, this will be recorded and available with the slides on the partnership's YouTube channel. So without further ado, I'll take it over to Bob and Susan. Thanks.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Bob Thibodeau with Seattle Jobs Initiative, one of the senior consultants here and working on this project. I'm glad to be here today. Susan, you want to go ahead and advance to the next slide? So just some general housekeeping. As you know, these are the same ones that we've used before in the previous sessions. Please keep your microphones on mute. And feel free to unmute if you want to chime in or ask a question, but during the question, we'll have a Q&A session at the end. And then keep your cameras on if possible. We'd like to see you. And then if you would go in and rename yourself so that we know your organization by your name. You can just click on the three dots that are in the menu for the webinar, and then type in and select to rename yourself, and you can type your organization by your name. And then be ready with your phone or your desktop browser to participate in our poll that we're going to have. As we did before in the previous ones, we're doing a Slido poll. So we'll be asking you some questions to kind of get your participation in this webinar as we move forward. And like Steph said, we will make this presentation, this PowerPoint, available to you after our session today. And I'm going to turn off my camera because it is kind of distracting, and I know you guys don't need to look at me. You can look at the presentation. Next slide. So we're going to test it out, and Susan's going to run the Slido show here. So what you need to do is open a new browser or window in your on your phone or on your computer, I think. You'll make sure that you leave your Zoom window open, and then open your camera on your mobile phone and aim it at the QR code on the screen.
You can do one or the other to get to the Slido poll. Go to Slido, or you can, when we open the poll, there will be a QR code on the screen. So it's kind of an either or. So I'll move over to our Slido poll. So We're going to ask if you made a New Year's resolution. I'd say if you did, and you want to share what it is, feel free to type that in. And again, you can navigate with the QR code, or you can type it into your browser. Go to slido.com, and then you'll enter the poll code that's shown on the screen. I did not make any New Year's resolutions this year.
Take it as it comes.
Is it New Year already?
Make a resolution for 2023. I like that one.
I want to know what the word of the year is.
Create.
Create. I like
Yeah.
it.
Good one. So hopefully everybody was able to get into that poll, and like I said, we'll be doing more later on in the presentation.
All right, I'll move on.
Yep, ready to move on. So like Steph alluded to, this is our third webinar in the series. And the next one coming on March 3rd, which will be building capacity for ENT. So look forward to that, and more information to come on that one. Next slide. So this is our agenda for today. We'll do a quick SNAP ENT funding review. We've talked about this before in our kind of our 101 review. And then I'll go into a little bit about 50/50 reimbursement opportunity and the different elements that you need to consider when you're considering what the potential is for your reimbursement. And then Susan will talk more about the program budget elements that you need to consider, as well as SNAP ENT budget focus items and budget strategies. And then, like Steph said, we have a special guest from Washington's Neighborhood House that will interject different parts of the presentation to show you some examples of kind of how they dealt with assessing their funding and their budgeting for SNAP ENT. Next slide. Next. So this is a Venn diagram you've seen before, the different elements of third-party partnerships. And of course, the one we're going to be focusing on today is your funding and assessing your funding. So just all those elements coming together will help you make the most out of getting the SNAP ENT 50/50 reimbursement. Next slide. So just again, a reminder of how the funding kind of flows and gets to you as a third-party partner. Once the state plan is approved, and of course the third-party partners have an input to that state plan when they submit their proposals and budgets to the SNAP agency. And once those are approved, then the federal funds get authorized by USDA FNS. The state agency then draws down that funding, and then the state agency is billed by you, the provider, based on when you do your billing, whether it's monthly or quarterly. Submit your billing to them, and then the state agency then issues payment to you as a third-party partner. Next slide. Another thing to consider in assessing your funding and everything is kind of the services that you provide. And what we have here is showing what the SNAP ENT components, and then as it relates to some of the services that a community action agency might provide. And we understand that your agency may not provide all these services, but it's just to give you kind of a picture of what the possibility is, what services you might be able to provide, as far as things that lead directly to employment, as well as some of the the administrative things that you do on the side, like assessing individuals and any job readiness training you do, life skills training, things like that, that are in your programs that you can possibly consider when we're thinking about what funding and what the potential is for reimbursements. Next slide. And another element, of course, is the individuals that you serve, the low-income individuals that are either receiving SNAP benefits or potentially eligible for SNAP. And again, the folks that are eligible for SNAP E&T have to be receiving SNAP benefits in the month that you're providing services and billing for them, and they can't be receiving a TANF cash assistance at the same time. Again, these are people that your program probably already serves, low incomes, people receiving SNAP or potentially eligible for SNAP. And really there's no need for you to do any special recruitment efforts because you're already serving this population. But there may be some additional tracking and case management that you need based on what the requirements are for the SNAP agency in your state. Next slide. So just a little bit about 50% reimbursement opportunity and things to consider around that based on your funding. So the process kind of to assess your funding is first of all to look at your revenue that you have coming in, and that's everything you got coming into your organization that's non-federal funding and that's not already matched or obligated to be matched to another federal source. And then you want to look at what might be tied to any SNAP E&T, eligible SNAP E&T activities that you're doing in your organization. So you're looking at the expenses that it takes to, the cost that it takes to provide those services or activities. And then you want to kind of carve those out as part of your when you're doing your budget. Then, like I said before, your participants, the folks that are either on SNAP E&T, SNAP, or potentially eligible for SNAP, that you're going to kind of guide them to applying for SNAP benefits. Next slide. So again, looking at your revenue, this kind of is a simplified version of what you might do as far as your revenue, the income you have coming in. It could be, state or county or city funds, any private donations that you get, foundation grants. And this is something that is kind of the exception to the rule as far as non-federal funds. We know that community development block grants are federal funding, but once it reaches your organization, it loses its federal identity and is the exception to the rule when it comes to being able to claim that as your match or your being able to draw down the 50% reimbursement for any eligible SNAP E&T services that you provide. Next slide. And now we're going to have Brianna chime in and talk about Neighborhood House, give you a little background on their organization. Brianna?
Thank you. I'm Brianna. It's good to be with you all. Neighborhood House is a multi-service agency, also a community action agency founded in 1906. We are one of the oldest social service agencies in the Seattle and King County region. Today, we provide a lot of different types of services to address holistic needs of families and individuals. Our mission is to build community and increase access to housing, health, education, and economic opportunity. We serve thousands of people annually in our King County region, and we have some key major program areas, which include early childhood education, youth development, employment and training, or employment and adult education, housing stability, aging and disability services, and community health. And I'm here to share with you a little bit about how we've utilized the SNAP E&T programming and sort of what some of the funding sources that we've used as an example. And these have fluctuated a little bit year by year, depending on the context and situation. But for our employment and training program, we tend to focus on utilizing local funding sources that are in our employment and adult education division, where there is an alignment in the types of services we are already providing with that funding. For us, we're currently utilizing funding from King County Housing Authority for a workforce program. We are using funding for workforce training and employment from Boeing Foundation. We are using King County Veterans, Seniors, and Human Services Levy funding for employment programs. And we also have added together contributions from various foundations that are funding our employment and training work. Excuse me, that's my cat. And what I think is neat here is that small amounts really add up when you are able to, double your money, so to speak, through drawdown of the 50% reimbursement funds. Thanks.
Thanks, Brianna. Yes, and I can tell you from my experience as the program manager for BFET for a while that Neighborhood House was one of our shining stars in our BFET program, and it was always good working with them. Somebody has had a comment or?
Yeah, I did. Brianna, I was going to ask you if you could talk a little bit about CDBG, if you don't mind.
Yeah, we have not used CDBG as a match source currently. And, initially I was thinking I think it's because we don't have CDBG funding that's specifically for our employment programs. It's for other types of services. So we haven't really contemplated that. But as I was thinking through that, I also thought, there's one program I need to explore to see if that would make sense or not. But up to now, we have not looked at that as a fund source.
I also see a question in the chat, Susan, about CSBG, and no, unfortunately, that is not eligible for 50% reimbursement because that is still considered federal funding. So.
Yeah, it's just a CDBG. Thanks, Brianna. I wanted to just call that out because, we know that's a potential opportunity, and it's one of those, just the one that is federal in origin, but that can still be used. But we do know that sometimes it's hard to find that alignment with the services that it funds. So something to consider when you're looking at your revenue sources.
Thanks for sharing that. Next slide. So this, again, the next step in it, of course, is looking at what expenses you have. And this is looking at all your expenses. And then later on, you would, carve out your SNAP E&T cost. And then at the same time, during this exercise, you're going to, cross out what things are not eligible. For example, your chemical dependency counselor expenses that you might have, you can't pay for participant meals, and then mental health support, contracted mental health support is not an eligible cost. So, but just to give you an idea how to kind of lay those things out and put your total cost in there. Next slide. And then you, again, as far as your participants, you want to look at kind of your total population and then look at what the potential is for SNAP and SNAP E&T. In this example, you have 75% may be eligible for receiving SNAP, which means they would be SNAP E&T eligible. You have 6% that are not SNAP eligible for one reason or another, and then you have 18% that are receiving TANF. So because they're receiving TANF cash, they're not eligible to be enrolled in SNAP E&T. The next slide. And then to kind of calculate, what you're going to use as your cost allocation percentage, you take that total number of clients that you're serving during a certain billing period, and then look at the total number of SNAP E&T clients that you're serving. And that will give you your percentage that you're going to use for your cost, where your staff cost, your operations costs, and things like that are you're using for SNAP E&T to support SNAP E&T participants. Next slide. And then again to Brianna to talk more about what Neighborhood House does with you know, with their program. Go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, we certainly do see, as I'm sure many of you share in this, that connecting with and navigation of the public benefits and various community resources is certainly aligned in a key part of our mission as a community action agency. So a lot of what, you know, when we're connecting with folks, we're asking about what public benefits they're already receiving, determining whether or not they may be interested and eligible for various public benefits. And so how we kind of approach that for our employment programs that for SNAP E&T is, you know, before we're enrolling them in our program, we of course just ask if they're receiving SNAP. And then if they are, we have a consent form at the ready that they can sign and allow us to look up the information to see if they're eligible for the program in the MIS system for Washington State. And then if they're not, we usually ask them about their eligibility and are available to assist with the process. Our state system called Washington Connections, we can help people do that online. And we also have some staff who are trained to go through the enrollment process with individuals, or we can refer, of course, to our to DSHS if they want to do that directly themselves in another way. But that's kind of generally part of our introduction piece to entering those programs. And then we sort of have a guide that we wrote up for staff in terms of if yes, this, and then if no, this, to distinguish so that we can get our allocation and kind of enrollment clear on who is we're count, you know, as part of our SNAP E&T program, and maybe who is in the program but not part of that for the reimbursement purposes. Thanks.
So looking at your expenses, there's basically two methods you can use to determine, you know, what cost you can apply towards your SNAP E&T budget. One is looking at your actual costs, and those are costs that are strictly for SNAP E&T participants. You know, if you have any specific materials that you're providing just for your SNAP E&T participants, if there's you know, certain programs that you do just for them, then you can use the actual cost of those programs or staff for that matter. If you have a staff member that, you know, works strictly on SNAP E&T participants, then you could claim that entire cost. Otherwise, most of the time what we see is an allocated cost. In other words, looking at your whole program, and then like I said before, carving out what you're going to be, what your expenses are for the actual SNAP E&T clients that you're serving. Based on, you know, that percentage that we talked about earlier. So things like, you know, your building maintenance costs, your rent, utilities, phone, insurance, and staff training, things like that. You can usually, what you end up doing is allocating the cost out for your SNAP E&T participants. Next slide. And then the final thing you want to look at is your indirect cost, things that you're not claiming on a line as a line item, your kind of your overhead for your programs. And there's basically three methods you can use for indirect cost. If your agency already has a federally approved indirect rate, then that's the one you must use for your SNAP E&T budget. If you don't have that, then there's one or two things you can do. You can kind of use the de minimis rate of 10%, or you would calculate a cost allocated indirect rate and have that approved by your SNAP agency that you contract with, as far as being able to use that in your budget. Next slide. So I'm going to pass it off to Susan now to talk about program budgets, and then she's going to take you through some of the Slido polls. Susan?
Thanks, Bob. So, you know, going through all the things that Bob just shared are sort of the steps you need to take to determine what would be your SNAP E&T budget. One thing to remember about a SNAP E&T budget is it's your best guess at what you think you're going to do and how you're going to perform. especially since it's so connected to the ratio of SNAP E&T versus non-SNAP E&T participants in your program. It's your guess, and then you bill on what actually happens. So that's always a really important thing to remember. But this slide just kind of shows again how you narrow down all the elements of your budget to get to what's SNAP E&T. So, you know, you start from the highest level of budgeting, you know, everything that's coming in, all the funding that comes into your program, all the expenses associated with your program. And then you might be narrowing it down to just what's employment and training, especially, you know, as community action agencies, you might do a lot of things that aren't necessarily tied directly to employment. So you have to find those aligned activities, those employment and training aligned activities. And then you have to look at the people that you're serving and make sure that you carve out and make a good estimate about who you think could be eligible. So again, you know, we think that you can take a look at your kind of current participant census and understand what potentially the eligibility mix is within your current caseload. And that's usually where we, you know, suggest you start a first budget from, is what you think you're kind of likely doing already. You can then sort of factor in maybe additional eligible participants if you recognize that you could do more sort of at the front end to make sure that people are accessing SNAP. But I would imagine as community action agencies, you're doing a lot of that work already. It's kind of, I think, central to a lot of what you do. So some of the things that might disqualify an individual would be, you know, receiving TANF. And we've talked about this before in our sessions, but you know, receiving TANF or other reasons why they're, you know, maybe their income for whatever reason doesn't make them SNAP eligible, but you can use all that information to understand who you're serving now to figure out who might be included in that budget. So we're gonna put it all on you now. I'm gonna have some Slido polls. The first one is name some sources or one source of allowable revenue for your organization. If, you know, think about the money that comes in and think about, you know, money that comes in to support employment and training aligned programs. And you don't have to name the actual source if you don't want to. You could just say foundation grants or CDBG. But if you can think of potentially one source of revenue that you think is allowable, write it down. And if you have any questions too at this time, feel free to chime in, unmute and ask questions.
Thing I forgot to mention, Susan, and Mary alluded to this in the chat, was the fact that once you receive that reimbursement, that 50% reimbursement, even though it comes down as it's federal money, it's still your money and loses its federal identity, and you can then reinvest that in your program and then get reimbursed again for eligible services that you use it for. So just something to note.
That's a really, yeah, good point. Yeah, it's kind of the big sort of not secret at all of SNAP E&T, but sometimes people can't really believe that that's an opportunity, that's legal, and it is.
Sometimes,
so,
yeah. We sometimes call it recycled funds or the gift that keeps on giving.
The gift that keeps on giving, yeah. And it's one of the big capacity builders of this program. So we have Foundation and United Way grants, state workforce dollars for training and education. Those are great examples of money that's probably funding exactly what you could be aligning with SNAP E&T. Local foundation grants, like Brianna mentioned, Boeing, city and county funding, again, those are examples that Brianna offered as well. State housing workforce asset programming, United Way, Mhm. So yeah, anything that is not federal in origin, and another little caveat is you might, if you are receiving a federal funding source that requires a match, you have to make sure that those dollars aren't dedicated to serve as that match. So they have to sort of be free and clear and not matched to another federal grant. I would love to hear from anybody who thinks that their CDBG could support their program. Also, just understanding how that it has to be tied with allowable expenses. If that looks like a possibility for anybody, I think we'd be really interested to hear about that. Yeah, Mary noted in the chat, revenues from any fees or services can also be used. Yep. And yeah, if that's something that's common among community action agencies, maybe not, but self-generated revenue. So that's a big one for social enterprises also. So if you're running some sort of mission-based business that helps support your program, that revenue can also be used. Well, I'll keep moving on. These are great examples, and if anybody has questions or specific things they want to say, feel free to, you can unmute and we can talk about it too. But I'll go to the next question. So now, think of any funds that you're getting that are not allowed, and maybe just offer an explanation of why. So, whether it's just because they're federal in origin, or if maybe that you match them to a federal grant, or they're not funding SNAP-E&T allowable activities. WIOA, great example. CSBG, also good thing to distinguish. CSBG is not allowed. That question gets asked a lot when we're talking about CDBG. And I'll say WIOA is not allowable. However, there's a lot of work happening right now in other areas of SNAP-E&T to just highlight ways that you can kind of integrate with WIOA. Since WIOA is so, services are so similar, there are often times where you can either braid that funding and integrate that funding with SNAP-E&T. There's a lot that goes around it, but CARES funding, yeah. So the CARES Act, I think if the monies, and Bob, you might help me out with this, because I know that ARPA funds, states were able to use ARPA funds sort of similarly to 100% funds. But I think if they're coming down, I think you're probably right for that. But I'm not gonna say a solid yes or no, just because I know that that's come up before. And Mary, I don't know if you've had any experience talking about CARES funding.
If I had to make the call, Susan, I would say that, if the organization receives that directly from the federal government, it's federal funds, and it's probably not eligible.
Yeah. I think you're right. Especially, yeah. You might be able to direct it towards some of your employment and training, but you can't draw down reimbursement. But these are good examples, and probably examples that are common for a lot of community action agencies. we'll keep moving on. Again, if anybody has questions, feel free to unmute and we can talk about it. So we're moving on to the expenses portion of your budget. So name 2 allowable expenses that are included in your program budget. So think about, staffing, personnel who are dedicated to SNAP E&T, but other, program services and expenses associated with that. And don't forget, even if some of those costs are hitting non-SNAP E&T eligible participants, there's a way to allocate based on your percentage. So it might not be that an entire full-time equivalent, and it's likely that you wouldn't dedicate an entire full-time equivalent to SNAP E&T, but a portion of their time can be allocated to SNAP E&T. And I'm going to just throw out some examples. Again, so yeah, employment specialist, case manager, staff time allocated. Any efforts, if you're offering direct employment training services or training, costs that are associated with that can be allocated to SNAP E&T. Payroll, admin, office space, exactly, case management services. Some of the
One thing
big
we haven't talked about too much today, Susan, is participant reimbursements or support services. Things like transportation assistance, clothing, tools, things like that would help the individual participate in the program.
Yes, absolutely. That's a big one. So if you think about all those support services that you that you offer to really help people persist, that's a huge area of for SNAP E&T. Childcare, yeah, childcare and or transportation could count, exactly. Yep. Childcare is a huge one, and transportation, but fringe, yep. Bus fees, staffing, yep, books. Yeah, any books or tools, if you're connecting somebody to some sort of training where they need special equipment or gear to do the class, all of that stuff can be reimbursed on. So I'll move on to the next question. You can probably guess, what types of expenses do you think are not allowed? And this might be a little bit more technical, and I can offer some examples. But, things that SNAP E&T can't cover are, mental health counseling. You can't use SNAP E&T to pay for meals. Those are 2 kind of big ones that I see come up a lot, or chemical dependency counseling. Those can't be covered. You can pay for somebody to have, maybe if they need a driver's license, that you can help them get their license. But if they have fines or that are preventing them from getting their license, you can't cover their fines. So there's just certain things that SNAP E&T can cover and certain things that they can't. Case management that is not within E&T scope of services and allowable activities. Yeah, that's exactly. So if it's, providing case management that's connected to like finding housing, and it's really separate from their employment plan, and then yeah, that wouldn't be an allowable expense. that gets a little hairy because typically, you know, often someone has one case manager who's working on all these different aspects of their participation. But yeah, you know, that's the right way to think about it. Like, you can't bill for things that aren't connected to E&T. Certificate fees and utilities. It depends on the certification. So again, like if you need to get a driver's license to be eligible to participate in your program or to be employed, that's actually a SNAP E&T allowable expense. Utilities, you're right, that's not an expense, that's allowable. There's another one that's kind of iffy is housing expenses. So SNAP E&T, depending on how your local SNAP agency makes policy around this, SNAP E&T can cover some emergency housing costs, like one-time expense if somebody is at risk of if they're getting evicted or something like that, or they're going to, you know, their housing situation, if they don't pay their rent, they're going to lose their house and they're not going to be able to participate. You might be able to cover that expense on a one-time basis. States make policy around that gets very specific about what they allow. But there is potential for you to be able to cover some emergency housing costs, but it does depend on the state that you're in, on how the policies they set around that. Housing deposits or two-year transfer and four-year education programs. Yeah, you know, SNAP E&T covers, it's really, you're supposed to be, if you're going to college, you know, there really has to be, it's vocationalized education that they need to be participating in. There isn't a time limit. So I think, you know, yeah, if they were applying to like a university and paying for all of the classes that are part of getting a bachelor's degree, then yeah, that's not SNAP E&T, but there are some four-year programs, you know, in Washington that potentially, if it's a vocationalized program, but again, it has to be a vocationalized education plan that SNAP E&T would cover. But yeah, and deposits for housing, exactly, that's not allowed. Any other questions or comments? I'll move on. So considering your current participant census, how many, and you can say this, you know, in rough percentage or numbers, either way, but how many would you estimate, do you think right now would be eligible for SNAP E&T in your program? So, you know, this is just a rough guess, but just kind of getting you to think about right now, if you had a SNAP E&T program, what would your percentage be? 25%? And this is really to just start you thinking about, so even if it was 25%, 40%, that's a pretty significant percentage that you could then be drawing down reimbursement from. But even 25% is fairly significant. 70%, yeah. I mean, if you think about eligibility, there's, you know, it could be a fairly high percentage of the people you're serving, potentially 30 to 40%. So I would say even those who are saying, you know, a quarter of your participants could be SNAP E&T eligible, that could still amount to a fair amount of reimbursement that comes into your program. So it could still be a worthwhile endeavor for you all. Any questions or anything anybody wants to chime in about before I move on? All right. One more question for you all. So describe any strategies that you have in place right now to assess the need or eligibility for SNAP in your program. And this really kind of gets at what we know about community action agencies is that this might be already a central part of what you do. And then we're going to ask Brianna to talk a little bit about how it's central to what Neighborhood House does too. But an example I would, say is like if somebody is already, sort of screening for connecting to people to benefits that they would be eligible for. Yeah, standardized intake, which asks about participation. Case manager intake.
I would say, Susan, the other thing to think about too is if the organization isn't already a SNAP outreach provider or partner, it would be to maybe partner with or try to create a partnership with a SNAP outreach organization in their state to kind of help them, know how to talk to individuals about applying for SNAP and being able to make that referral to get help for the individual to apply for SNAP benefits.
Exactly. And Brianna, I know you did already talk about that a little bit when we were talking about maximizing your percentage. So again, all of this is to say that it's likely something you're already doing. It's sort of central to who you are as organizations to really think about connecting people to benefits. So, just another way to show that your organizations may already be very well aligned for SNAP E&T. And while you can't get funded through SNAP E&T to put people on SNAP or refer, to do the SNAP outreach, it might already be something you're doing. So then that's just kind of a natural funnel for, connecting people to employment and training. So somebody says that they have an admin assistant that reviews eligibility online, sees if current clients are on SNAP, but not on TANF, and they use that for both SNAP outreach and application assistance and SNAP E&T. Yeah, so in some states, SNAP E&T partners have access to the state managed, data system where they can look in and see online if somebody's eligible. Really great opportunity when that is an opportunity. Not all states are there yet, but when you do have that opportunity, it makes it really streamlined. There's other ways when you don't have access to the MIS that state agencies set up a process that you can check for eligibility manually. Sometimes it means that you have a contact at the SNAP agency that you work with, or you're just helping people through however that SNAP agency does SNAP applications. All right, I'm going to move on. These are great, just great ways, thank you for sharing, and hopefully this helps everyone start thinking about how this aligns with the work you're doing. And I'm going to take it back to Brianna just to kind of sum it up and just talk a little bit more about why SNAP E&T is why they do it and how it helps their program.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, we do expand our capacity and thus are able to serve more people in our region. And I think, collectively, multiple agencies doing that too, it does have quite an impact. So our program does create program capacity. And it depends year by year. Currently through our SNAP ENT program, we fund and add an additional 1.5 to 2 FTE of direct service staffing, employment specialists or case managers. In some years that's been larger, and it just depends on what we've got available in that particular year and what we propose to the SNAP agency for our budget. But it has allowed expansion of our employment services. And also what we were able to do with it as well is utilize some foundation funds to add capacity for employment services within our housing stability program, so that we could add that component really embedded within that program to serve all the participants and working that participants of our housing stability programs, and that added capacity and more of a holistic approach to those programs as well. And we're only able to fund that full position by because the foundation contribution that we had was not enough for a full FTE. We were able to do it because we used it for reimbursement and because the services were aligned with what we knew we needed in that particular program area. So yeah, all in all, I would say we have kind of a way that we assess for what we want to include in our program and what makes sense in terms of, of course, certainly it is work, as we all know, when we're dealing with new programming, new billing, new data systems. So we just assess like the impact, of course, and what makes sense, what's worthwhile, and what does make sense for us is when we're able to expand that capacity and in a holistic way, and really add value, align with our strategic plan for our programs. And I just wanted to say too that sounds like some organizations already have this set up, some are thinking about it. But I think it's a great chance to have a community here, and I would be open, if anyone wants to chat more at some point, or talk about how we organized that with our teams and how we expanded it, or how we assessed how to go about all the various steps to put things in place. Be happy to connect.
Be careful what you offer, because now you're on our list, Brianna.
Well, this is part of the community, right?
That's great. Thank you for that. Any questions before, I have just a few more slides that are really just kind of, helpful tips for thinking about this, but I just want to make sure that if anybody wants to ask Brianna anything or respond to what we've talked about so far.
This is Steph. I have one question, and I think the group might want to hear about it. If you guys could talk about the concept of double dipping. I know we've got some fiscal folks here, so that might be helpful.
Yeah, that's actually my next slide.
Oh, wow.
So, but
it's that kind of day.
Brianna, if you want to talk about any, if there's anything specific that Neighborhood House has had to address with that, or otherwise I'm happy to kind of go into that conversation.
Yeah, go for it, Susan, and I'll see if I can think of an example or something as you go through kind of that concept.
Sure. So managing funding streams and how you can approach that. So you can kind of think, it depends on maybe how risk averse your organization is and how much they really want to get creative and how they're funding your program. Some folks take kind of a braided funding approach. And this comes up a lot when we're talking about WIOA, because WIOA does a lot of similar services. You really have to think about where there might be opportunity for SNAP ENT to maybe pick up where WIOA can't. And that we sort of talk about braiding and integrating. So that could mean that you have participants who are receiving services both through WIOA and both through SNAP ENT. And it's a process of just being really, getting in front of it from the beginning and carving out what's WIOA, what's SNAP ENT. And I'm just going to use WIOA. There could be other funding, federal funded programs as well, and this would all apply the same. But, you know, there are ways that you can kind of leverage one. Maybe it's a sequencing process where somebody, and again, I'll use WIOA, maybe Snappy and T might be the better approach for somebody who may need more kind of remediation services before they would be hitting some of those outcomes that WIOA requires. So you start them in Snappy and T, and then they move on to WIOA services. A lot of different ways to think about it. The other way you can really look at it is that you just really create a firewall around your federal programs and just ensure that there's no double dipping, as we say. And that really means that, you know, you're not billing both programs for the same service. Obviously, that is a no-no in the world of federal funding, or the world of any funding, really. But or that you're not supplanting, or so, you know, every federal funding stream kind of has this, you know, you use us as your last resort kind of mandate. And, you know, the way you would do that is just that you have, you know, these separate programs that are serving different individuals, and you kind of draw those lines all the way from the beginning of when you're just budgeting for your programs. So some organizations choose to take that sort of very risk averse approach, which is totally what, you know, if that's where you're comfortable, it's a really safe way to just make sure that you're not using federal fundings, two federal funding streams to fund the same program. Very important concept to kind of think through, and you know, decisions that you kind of have to make from a fiscal perspective and a program perspective when you're thinking about becoming a Snappy and T partner, if you have other federally funded programs. Steph, did you have any other questions about that, or anybody else have questions or comments?
You answered it, but I know, you know, it rightfully comes up. And then some folks, you know, you guys touched on it before, where you're kind of surprised, like, oh, wow, this is allowable. So it's just kind of the other side of the coin.
Yep. And I would just say, you know, there's a lot of thought that has to go into it. Bob and I were just coincidentally just working with an organization in Chicago, and just were meeting with them prior to this webinar, who's going through that process right now of figuring out the feasibility of adding Snappy and T to their program that they're largely funded through WIOA, and finding where there's opportunity, and trying to make some of these decisions about whether they're braiding the funding for their participants, or just kind of doing these separate kind of siloed programs. Both could be good options. It's really kind of depends on what you do, and there's a lot of variables.
I will offer that we tend to separate our funds, and kind of we have these like staff guides, and kind of defined both from the cost allocation in our timesheet cost center approach, but also from looking at how we charge our time, and separate between not only the participants who are eligible or not eligible, and part of that, the program, and also whether or not the local fund source that we're utilizing offers additional activities that are not ENT, so that we also just kind of carve that out as well, that like all those activities get charged to the local source only. But once it's set up and down on paper, I think it's pretty straightforward to follow, and everyone kind of has that to reference back to as a little guide. But we've also tried to do some different approaches for braiding as well. And I think that would be an interesting conversation to connect with in future, kind of different approaches people, organizations have utilized. Because there's a lot of different conversation around that going on here locally as well.
Thanks, Brianna. Yeah, happy to, you know, I think those, I know that especially the WIOA Snappy and T conversation is just kind of getting louder. And so hopefully more to come, and more examples to emerge for people to look at. Moving on. So these are just some common issues that come up when you're budgeting. And I know we're running out of time, so I'll go through this quickly. You you know, look at few positions will be a full-time equivalent 100% because of the fluctuation of SNAP and non-SNAP E&T eligible participants and how that can fluctuate from month to month. You know, take a good look at what's eligible in terms of expenses, all these things that we talked about. A couple things I'll focus here. Reasonable and necessary is sort of the guidelines that the USDA offers for participant reimbursements in those support services. And being able to explain and justify what you've included in your SNAP E&T budget. So be ready to kind of have that. Sometimes there's gray area and you need to have a conversation with your SNAP agency. So be kind of ready for that piece. As always, we always link to the SNAP E&T toolkit, and we will here too, that where you can really kind of explore more what USDA considers reasonable and necessary, and some of their policies around allowable costs could be a good resource for you to all look at. So we'll make sure we point to that. Again, your budget is your best estimate. Support services are really can be an important part of your budget, and the fact that you can get reimbursed on it, it can be really advantageous. Don't forget that your time and effort of variety of staff, as long as it's cost allocated, can be included in your budget, and those indirect rates, which we know are real and should be included in your budgets as well. That's all I have. I think I might have even gone a little over time, so thank you all for your time. But these are the resources here. The SNAP E&T toolkit and SNAP to Skills is just been the big SNAP E&T kind of technical assistance effort from USDA. And there's some good resources and just material that might be good on that website. And that's all I've got, Steph.
Yeah, that's a lot. That's super helpful. We are a little over, but I did want to save time if anyone on the call had specific questions that weren't already addressed. Now's the time to ask. Brianna is a rock star, and yes, I'll be reaching out to you, want to thank you, but to get some insight, but awesome that you're offering up help. I just kind of quintessential community action. Okay, well, if no one has questions, again, this will be available with the slides on the partnerships YouTube site. Feel free to look it up, and we'll see you guys March 3rd, if not before. Thank you.
Everybody, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.